Okay. All right, we're about to start, so just waiting for everybody to settle down. Welcome to the Vancouver Aquarium. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight we're streaming our talk live over to our Vancouver Aquarium YouTube channel, so I'd like to have a special hello to all the viewers online. Our public programming team is hoping to reach people in our audience, but also people online who have an interest in conserving aquatic life, which, as you know, is the mission of the Vancouver Aquarium. Before I start, I'm just going to remind you to mute your phones. I think that most people are used to muting their phones before events now. So, our first speaker, we have 3 speakers tonight, giving 3 different perspectives on biodiversity. And our first speaker is Dr. Jeanette Witten. She will be talking about what is biodiversity and the research that she's been doing in this area. She's an associate professor at the Department of Botany at the UBC. She completed BSc in environmental biology at McGill, a PhD in the University of Connecticut. And her research is in the area of plant evolution and focusing on understanding how new species arise and what happens when related species interbreed in nature. She also serves as director of the UBC Herbarium, and she is part of the UBC's Biodiversity Museum. So, Dr. Witten. Yeah, you can use this mic if you like. Okay. Good. Does that work okay?
Yep. Okay, good night, everyone, and thanks for coming. So my task for this evening is just to give you a science perspective on why biodiversity matters. And probably for this audience, my guess is I could just show the pretty picture and say, because look, and we could move on from there. But I'll take a few minutes nonetheless and just give you maybe some additional points and arguments that you never know could come in handy and hopefully introduce you to a few concepts that might be new to you. So if just because is one way of summarizing what I want to say to you, this is another. So it sounds a little bit like something that Donald Rumsfeld once said, but please don't hold that against me. So we could summarize the talk in basically this brief statement that biodiversity matters because of what we know about the past, because of what we know about the present, and because of what we don't know about the past, the present, or the future. And so I want to elaborate on these points just by way of a few examples to illustrate each. And so first thing that I'm going to realize is that I have a slide out of order, so I'm going to go on from there. So in terms of what we know, here are some basic things that we know about biodiversity. We know that extinction is natural. We know that extinction has happened basically since the beginning of biodiversity. But mass extinctions are a special form of natural disaster that last a long time. So the effects of mass extinctions go on for quite a long time. We know that biodiversity provides us with products as well as with services that we rely upon and that we use, and that would be costly or else impossible to replace. And I'll present a few research facts to support this. We also know that humans are the drivers of global change, on a global scale that's impacting biodiversity and includes the fact that we're driving species towards extinction. And this, too, is an irrefutable fact. So let's elaborate on a few of these. So this panel here is showing you a slide that I use for teaching, and it shows in millions of years ago from the present to 600 million years ago, 5 spikes in the rate of extinction that's experienced over a short period of time. And these 5 spikes are what are referred to as the big 5 mass extinctions. So the extinction rate here is shown in terms of taxonomic families lost per million years. And those 5 spikes are of critical importance. The third one here is the granddaddy of all mass extinctions. That's the mass extinction at the end of the Permian, which is thought to have wiped out about 90% of the species on Earth. Now, one of the things that sometimes gets reported when we think about the current extinction crisis is that extinction has happened naturally forever. And I want to highlight to you a couple of ways, a couple of simple facts about the mass extinctions of the past relative to our current extinction crisis. One of which is that mass extinctions like the mass extinction at the end Permian didn't happen over the span of decades, but over the span of millennia. So when we talk about the potential of losing 30 to 50% of species over the next 100 years, bear in mind that this loss of 90% of species that happened somewhere between over a period of somewhere between 160,000 and about 3 million years. So the rate at which we're losing species is much greater than occurred in the time of even the greatest mass extinction. Another point that it's important to bear in mind is that recovery of ecosystems takes a long time. And so when we think again in current time frames about the fact that, well, we've recovered from mass extinctions in the past, we will recover again, bear in mind that estimates of the time to recovery, to rebuilding complex ecosystems with food webs that resemble those prior to the mass extinction is estimated to take something like 30 million years. And so when we think about recovery from extinction events, we need to think on these timescales. We're not talking about impacting our grandchildren's generation. We're talking about impacting the probability of our own species surviving. And that highlights another point in that we're usually far too arrogant to consider that we could be one of the species lost in such a mass extinction event. So another thing that we know about biodiversity is that healthy ecosystems are good to us. So this image here is showing us in dark green the boreal forest, the outlines of the boreal forest. The boreal forest does many, many things for us. It sequesters carbon, it purifies our air, and it provides many services on less than continental scales as well. Clean water, of course, is important to us, is vital to us. But in addition to that, some of the services and some of the products that are provided are direct economic benefit to us. So I'm showing you a salmon stream, and I'm showing you a pollinator here. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about pollination because it's perhaps one of those services that you've heard about recently in the news, or maybe you haven't. So we have a number of crops that rely upon pollinators, and I've put some of the flashier ones here. Things like apples and cherries and blueberries and cranberries may not be the largest calorie sources globally, but they tend to catch your attention if you think about the possibility of losing those crops as a result of pollinator failure. I added squashes because I kind of like them. They're not on the, perhaps not quite on the scale of blueberries and cherries around here. So in Canada, the value of pollinator services is estimated to be on the order of $2.2 billion per year. And so this is a cost that we would have to subsidize if pollinator populations crash. Now, you may have heard that there are declines that are being experienced now in pollinator populations, especially in honeybees. That's the pollinator that gets the most attention. Now, honeybees are essentially, well, they may not seem very domesticated, but they are definitely a managed species. But we're also seeing impacts in natural pollinator populations. And we don't fully understand the causes of those declines, but we do understand that there are diseases that are playing a role, that climate change seems to be playing a role in terms of desynchronizing other pollen sources that are necessary for maintaining healthy natural pollinator populations from the timing of development of the pollinators themselves or from their migration in the case of butterflies. So I know from personal experience that we're not very good pollinators. So we've done pollination experiments in our favorite plant here, these Easter daisies that I'm showing you. And for us to do pollinations costs a whole lot of money. And I'm being a little bit facetious here in highlighting this, but flying pollinators, natural pollinators, get full seed set. They do it for free. When we go out there and do pollinations, we don't get full seed set. We're not that good at it, and when the snow comes, we go back to UBC and we don't come back and do it again, whereas the natural pollinators are always there. And so it's just by way of illustration that, that these are features of the ecosystem that are providing services to us that we don't often consider in terms of economic, potential economic costs and benefits. So there are several things that we also don't know about the natural world. For example, we don't know how much damage can be sustained by natural ecosystems before they're unable to provide those services for us. We know from ongoing research that many butterfly populations are in decline, but we don't have a plan for how to recover those, and we don't know how resilient they are and whether or not they will be able to bounce back, or at what point we'll start to lose those species. We don't know how to predict the consequences of loss or addition of individual species to ecosystems. So in community ecology research, we're learning a lot about the resilience of ecosystems. We're learning a lot about the traits of communities, but that does not allow us yet to, and it may never allow us to predict what happens when an individual species is lost from a particular ecosystem. And from my own research, I'll mention that we don't know whether the recovery of Canada's species at risk is likely, and I'll talk a little bit about this as well. So this is classic research done by Dave Tillman's group, and this panel is showing you a couple of things. It's showing you the plots where this research is done. So this is a very large garden plot in Minnesota. And each of the little squares there is divided into an experimental plot where they've seeded either 4, 8, 2, 4, 8, 12, or 16 different plant species. And they've been following these species for over a decade now, moving on to close to 20 years now. And what they're interested in looking at is how resilient are plots that have different numbers of species in them. And so I'll walk you through these data slides here, which are kind of cool. So what we're looking at on the y-axis here in the top panel, panel B, is ecosystem stability. So that's a measure of year-to-year ability of those plots to produce a certain amount of biomass. And so what you can see is that with increasing numbers of species in the plots, so up to 16 species, stability increases. So in other words, the year-to-year variation in how much plant growth they see from plot to plot is the year-to-year variation is less. So these populations here, these plots with 16 species, are more stable. They don't vary much from year to year. And so what we believe is underlying that, or what the researchers hypothesize is underlying that, is that if you have a lot of species and you have a dry year, you've got a species or two that are good at dry years. You have a wet year, you have a few species that are good at wet years. So the more species you have, the more compensation you can do within that community. On the other hand, that's offset by what you see in the bottom here, which is that the species stability, so the stability of individual species, actually declines for a while and then more or less levels off. So individual species may not be so stable in that situation, which is what you'd predict if they're all complementing one another. But overall, the system is quite resilient. So this research is not without controversy, which is why I said that these kinds of ecosystems with many species are often more resilient. This is a very active area of research. There's a lot of debate in this area. But as I hinted at the beginning, or a few minutes ago, this doesn't necessarily allow us to extrapolate very broadly beyond these systems. So there's a few things that are quite simple about this system. One, they're all plants, so there's no trophic levels. There's no herbivores that are being taken into consideration. There's no predators on those herbivores, etc. So we would like to know better how these kinds of factors, how biodiversity impacts stability across those trophic levels, for example. So there's still limitations in terms of how we elaborate this, but researchers by and large are reasonably convinced, building a consensus towards more stability coming from systems that have more species. One type of species that is always very hard to study in these kinds of systems are rare species, because scientifically it's just more difficult to track the infrequent members of communities and what they're doing and how we can expect them to respond. But we do know that communities change, sometimes in predictable ways and sometimes in unpredictable ways when species are removed. So we know, for example, from data from Alaska, that declines in sea otter populations contribute to the growth of sea urchin populations and then to declines in kelp beds. So probably many of you are familiar with this three species interaction. There are actually many more species that interact as well. But when sea otters are removed, sea urchin beds can expand and they can essentially come to be the dominant species in the ecosystem, and they eat their way through the kelp beds and essentially become monocultures. And my understanding of this is that even when sea otter populations then increase, the response of these systems is not completely predictable. And so they don't always return exactly to this three-species system that we saw before. So I want to turn for the next few minutes to thinking about the Species at Risk Act. The Species at Risk Act was one of the focal pieces of legislation covered by the Commissioner's report. And I'm pulling here from the preamble to the Species at Risk Act, and this is a little wordy, but it describes SARA's purposes. And I want to highlight a few things here, so I'll read it to you. The purposes of this act are to prevent wildlife species from being extirpated or becoming extinct. So a species is extirpated when it no longer occurs in Canada. It's extinct when it no longer occurs anywhere. To provide for the recovery of wildlife species that are extirpated, endangered, or threatened. Those are three risk categories under the Species at Risk Act. And that have become threatened, endangered, or extirpated as a result of human activity. And in addition to that, to manage species of special concern, a lower risk category, to prevent them from becoming endangered or threatened. So there are various facets here to the legislation, but key to them are prevention and recovery. Okay? You want to keep things from getting worse, and then you want to actually make them better. So the way that SARA is laid out is essentially a four-step process. You probably could divide it slightly differently, but this is how, this is an obvious way of dividing the steps. Species are first assessed at the top, and that's a process that's done by an independent scientific body. Species are then listed or not listed, and all the subsequent steps are led by government. So the government does not necessarily list every species that's assessed as at risk by the scientific committee. The listing decision represents a compromise or an outcome that considers various other factors, including stakeholders and socioeconomic considerations. For species that do get listed, if they're listed as in the high-risk categories, threatened, endangered, or extirpated, then a recovery plan has to be developed for that species that describes what it will take for the species to recover. And then subsequent to that, there's recovery action planning that describes the specific steps that have to be taken immediately to help this species to recover. The words immediately, the term immediately is a little bit misapplied here in that it's important to consider that as far as our experience suggests, this is probably at minimum a 10-year process to get to the action plan. There are more than 500 species that are in need of recovery strategies at this time. A good chunk of those are done, but there are just 7 species that have action plans to date, 10 years after SARA was enacted. So as part of a team of researchers working at UBC, including people from UBC and Simon Fraser, we undertook an evaluation of recovery strategies. So we used the documents that are available on the public website, and we assessed various facets of recovery strategies. Now I want to focus on just one facet here, in part because the Commissioner's report covers many of the other aspects. And this one is a little more science-y. So I'll start here. So recovery strategies under SARA, and this is according to the Commissioner's report, provide the overall goals and objectives for the recovery or protection of species at risk and form the basis of monitoring and reporting on progress. It's important to know that you don't have to have a recovery strategy to begin to take action, but it is a guiding document and an umbrella document, okay? And certainly it's a document for accountability. So we looked at one facet of these documents, and that's the goals that they set. And I have to tell you that based on our assessment, we are concerned about the goals that are being set in the recovery strategies and whether or not they are sufficiently ambitious to actually lead to species recovery. So to do this, we had to develop our own little index of ambition. So recovery strategies can state objectives for populations. So how many populations should there be on the landscape, what we have now or more than we have now? For individuals, the total number of reproductive individuals in Canada, and for distribution area. So maybe we don't need more populations, but we need them to cover a broader area than is currently covered to get closer to historical distributions. So we scored our objectives following this scale from least ambitious, when an objective simply wasn't stated, to most ambitious, restoring historical levels for any of those facets. And I just want to show you a couple of slides here. For most species, our goals are to maintain current. And to be truthful, the wording here is usually maintain or increase. But I know that when I, for example, tell my kids that they can do housework for 1 or 2 hours, they're usually going to do 1, not 2. And I suspect that we're mostly the same and that the government is likely to be the same as well. If you can achieve success by maintaining and achieve the goal, you may not be compelled to increase. So we wanted to know a little bit about which species are more likely to be beneficiaries of ambitious goals. And so we looked at a bunch of features that might correlate with the ambition of the goals. And the Ord's kangaroo rat here doesn't have very ambitious goals, but it turns out that sage grouse does. And in fact, there's a few patterns that emerge, and I'll just show you those in summary here. So some groups of species have more ambitious goals, and some of these we suspected would be true, like birds, which are very charismatic, but also fish and mollusks, and not tetrapods, so not mammals, for example. We see more ambitious goals for some aspects of species that are at greater risk. So endangered species have more ambitious goals than threatened species. But we don't place a greater importance on species that are at risk globally, so for which Canada might be more responsible, or for Canadian endemics. So they're not more likely to have more ambitious goals. So overall, what we find is a relatively low level of ambition without any clear explanation as to why. This just highlights the data that we observed. So our ambitious goals are higher for birds. Species with higher ambition are more likely to be birds than when you consider the distribution of birds amongst all of the groups. Another thing that surprised us is that it doesn't matter why the species was listed. So this is a subset of species that were listed because they're in sharp decline. So there are various ways that species can get to a listing designation. These species are all in sharp decline, and yet their goals are still primarily to maintain current levels of individuals, populations, and distribution area. So fewer than half the strategies state objectives that go beyond maintaining the status quo. And we have to ask from that, or I have to ask from that, whether meaningful recovery can be achieved without actually targeting increases for these species at risk. There are still some bright spots despite these kinds of limitations in the strategies. So North Atlantic right whale is a species that is highly endangered. It does have a recovery plan. The recovery plan states that the goal is to see modest increases. The recovery plan was completed in 2009. In 2013, when the species was reassessed, increases had been observed, but it's hard to say that that was directly linked to any specific action outlined in the recovery plan. Nonetheless, shipping lanes have been adjusted to avoid ship strikes, and fishing gear has been modified to decrease entanglement. But I would say that even biologists have been surprised by the increases that this particular species has seen. So recovery is the process by which the decline of an endangered, threatened, or extirpated species is arrested or reversed, and threats are removed or reduced to improve the likelihood of persistence in the wild. And a species will be considered recovered when its long-term persistence has been secured. This is what we're looking for, but for many species, including black-footed ferret, this seems unlikely. And I'll leave you with just this one last example. This is a species that is considered extirpated, gone from the wild in Canada. It's subject to a reintroduction plan. But if what we're looking for is recovery, to date our plan is to reintroduce the species into one population. Now there are some real limitations on the habitat for this species, but we have to ask whether these kinds of efforts are actually going to take us to what we would call recovery. The analogy is usually made that recovery, that listing species is putting them into the emergency room. And my concern as a biologist looking at some of these goals is that they're not going to move out of the emergency room. They're moving into palliative care instead, where we're managing them at very low levels in a status that we would not actually call recovered. And so with that, I'll leave the podium and take questions, I suppose, later on. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Witten. Yeah, so try and remember the questions you have, because we're going to save them all for the end, and then maybe we'll get 3 different perspectives on your question. So our next speaker is Mr. Neil Maxwell. He will be talking about the status of biodiversity in Canada and what they found in their 2013 report. He is the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development for the Office of the Auditor General. He received his Master of Public Administration and Bachelor of Arts degree from Queen's. He is experienced in performing auditing in a wide range of federal organizations, most recently involving agriculture, health, the environment, and government-wide activities, such as those related to the effectiveness of measurement reporting. He has led many audits in areas relating to environment and sustainable development. So, Mr. Maxwell? I have to get your presentation. Let me get the right presentation up for you.
Okay. Well, I'll start, as Nadine is doing all that technical thing. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's great to share the stage with James and Jeanette, and Jeanette's done a very good job of introducing some of the things that are quite central to the work that we did this year. So we have a slide presentation up there. We need the thingy.
We need the thingy. There we go.
Yes, and now we're going to get adjustment, and I am a bit taller than Jeanette. Great. So I'm going to talk about the work that we did this year on biodiversity. We looked at quite a number of things that the federal government does in terms of protecting biodiversity in this country. And the federal government, as you'll hear, has a very central role in that, not to the exclusion of provinces and civil society. They all play a very of the Environment Sustainable Development was created in that very heady days before and after the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. We were part of that institutional building. Essentially, our function is to, and it's a very unique role, essentially, and probably the most important thing for you to know is we don't focus on policy. We leave the questions about the merits of policy to many other actors, many other institutions, many think tanks in terms of arguing for certain policies. We really focus, and in this we have quite a unique role, we really focus on the question of how well is the federal government managing those responsibilities? How well is it implementing those policies? So a lot of what we do, and again, a very unique thing, nobody else is really doing quite what we're doing in that regard. Very analogous, we're housed within the Office of the Auditor General. We do several different things. The main product that we have is something we call performance audits. This is basically the same thing that you will know from media reports that the Auditor General does. So these are audits much like the Auditor General does. Except that these focus specifically on the environment and sustainable development. We do two other things, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. We have an important role in terms of sustainable development strategies in the federal government, and also run a process called the environmental petitions process. We're going to talk mainly about what we do in this auditing role. And I'm going to skip that. So this is what we did in this report. And I'll go through each of these in turn. I think what I'll do is I'll try to kind of build up. I'll talk about each of the different things we looked at, key roles that the federal government is doing, and then try to bring this all together in terms of some overarching messages that come out of this work. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. So I will start with, so we put together a report each year. It goes to Parliament. That's our job. We have essentially provided information to Parliament. We have chapters in this book. The first piece that we did this year was a backgrounder, and it's something we don't often do, but we, in our discussions with parliamentarians, what became quite clear is this is a very daunting subject, biodiversity, conservation, preserving nature. It has big words like biodiversity. It has concepts like ecosystem services, and Jeanette's done a good job of explaining ecosystem services and how you can actually put monetary values on things like that. So we essentially did a piece to try to inform parliamentarians about why this is an important subject, and made a number of different points. Actually, Jeanette's covered many of them, so I'll be quite brief. I think the central argument of this piece of our work was to say that this is important not just to naturalists and environmentalists and people that get it, but important to all Canadians, important in terms of our socioeconomic prosperity. It's everything from, touches our daily lives, and that's what ecosystem services, that concept really speaks to. It's all about the soundness, the integrity of those ecosystems impacts the quality of water we drink. It impacts on our pharmaceuticals. About half of pharmaceuticals over the counter and prescription drugs have some plant derivation. It impacts the food we eat. We use the same example. Jeanette's done a nice job of exploring the example of pollination services. $2 billion a year, as Jeanette argued. How important sound ecosystems are to the food we drink. So it impacts Canadians in terms of everyday life. We also talked a lot about how it impacts on the economy. You think of this in many different ways. You think of the jobs. If you look at something like the fisheries sector, that's a $7 billion a year sector. The forestry sector, $24 billion. So very sizable parts of our economy depend on sound ecosystems. There are other aspects of the economic argument. I'll come back to this when I kind of try to pull all these things together. But point being is that we try to bring this together in terms of a reference document. We write one of these when we do some literature searching and discover that no one has really pulled it all together quite that way. So we did this, and we think it's a fairly unique way of pulling all the messages together. It makes a very strong argument, as Jeanette, I think, has argued very compellingly, about the, maybe 2 points about ecosystems. First of all, ecosystems, I think of ecosystems as essentially at the tail end of all the other environmental disruptions that we impose on this planet. So, and that actually is one of the huge challenges of maintaining ecosystems. It's not impacted by a single factor, it's basically impacted by all the other issues. So climate change, overexploitation of resources, invasive species, all the pollution issues, toxicology, et cetera. So ecosystems, that's part of the variability in and challenges that Jeanette spoke of as well. And we also talked very much, and again, she's done a nice job of that, of just how limited our scientific knowledge is of how ecosystems actually function and what happens when you take a species out of the mix. We used the example of the collapse of the Atlantic cod as a good example. Scientists didn't see it coming, nor can we even now explain why it is that the cod species haven't rebounded. So anyway, enough on that. So then into the meat of this piece. It's hard to read this slide, and I'm not hitting this clicker well enough, apparently. There we go. Oh, it's queued up. I hit it 5 times and it went through 5 slides. I go here. So the first piece that we did, and I mentioned a little bit of history. So the other thing that happened about the time that we were created, Earth Summit, Rio, some of you weren't born then, I can see. Very important, seminal event, perhaps not equaled since. One of the key things that Canada tried to achieve there was we were very strong champions of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this convention, we were the first country to ratify it as well, coming out of Rio. So a convention that really that has some important commitments internationally by the parties to each other in terms of protecting conservation. Over its sort of a fast forward to current days, and the convention is focused very much on a strategic planning exercise to get all parties to the convention to essentially say to do some planning within their own jurisdiction, their own country, to focus on the biodiversity issues that are most central to that area, that geography. And so we did some work on this. Environment Canada led an exercise to try to come up with goals for 2020. These are all grounded in terms of things that each country is trying to achieve by 2020. We had some good things to say. Environment Canada led quite a good exercise to consult and engage people in terms of what that should look like. Probably the key thing coming out of this was concern that the goals really don't have enough specificity. They don't have enough. This is something that auditors bring to the table. So each profession brings certain insights into what success looks like and what's necessary for success. And one of the insights that I think auditors bring to the table is the idea that good management actually matters. So our message here, and you'll hear some of this in some of the other areas, planning matters. So there's some very interesting goals that have been set. We've all been set for us through this process. Things like to maintain, maintain and restore wetlands. We were critical of a number of those targets as being too vague. We were critical of other ones about not being clear about, where targets were fairly clear, still a lack of clarity about who was going to do what and when to achieve that. So that's essentially the message that we had for Parliament in terms of this this part of our work. And again, yeah, we talked about a few other things. Again, back to the question of putting a monetary value on ecosystem services. Environment Canada, along with a number of other institutions, the Suzuki Foundation's done a lot of work in this area as well, trying to actually put economic values on those services. And we talked about what Environment Canada is doing, which was largely a positive message. So, it just doesn't seem responsive. There. I have to kick it maybe. The next piece that we did, this is getting into more mainstream things that the federal government does, is looking at another bit of international agreements. This is actually dates from 1916, and this is the Convention on Migratory Birds that we entered into in that year with the United States. And this was largely in an era where hunting was quite prevalent, and people realized externalities, realized that if all the birds had migrated south and the Americans devastate the population, that would impact on Canada and vice versa. So 2 countries entered into what was one of the first international agreements in terms of environmental protection. So we looked at how Canada was doing in terms of this. One of the things, there was quite a bit of focus, quite a bit of attention by parliamentarians on this next point. One of the things that we noted was considerable concern about bird populations. So 3 entire groups of birds, shorebirds, grassland birds, and aerial insectivores, basically birds that eat insects in flight, swallows and the like. three entire groups of birds have declined in a relatively short span of time since the 1970s by 40 to 60%. So again, not individual species, as Jeanette was talking about, but entire groups of birds. So there was quite a bit, I would say a number of people really found that an alarming statistic, and I think it is a sobering one for sure. We talked about two other specific things. One was in terms of what Environment Canada, what the federal government is actually trying to do with migratory birds. A big part of this is conservation planning. In some ways, with some strong similarities to the SARA recovery strategies, but in a much more global, much larger span. Essentially, conservation strategies for migratory birds in a geographical area. Environment Canada committed to complete those by 2010. We found that only about half of those have been done. What was of more concern to us, again, I mentioned a similar example a moment ago, was that the strategies that have been completed don't specify those basics of who's going to do what to whom and what's it going to cost and when a thing is going to be finished. So strategies that are largely provide some direction, but again, not the sort of necessary elements that experience would say are important to success. There's a number of other things. I'm going to try to, mindful of time, state some of the highlights of each of these components and then perhaps bring some of this together in question period. I'll go on to talk about another important thing the federal government does. It has a lot of land. It manages a lot of land. That's in terms of the national parks. I'll talk more about the national parks in a moment. This piece of our report focused on something much lower profile. Environment Canada has a very interesting system of migratory bird sanctuaries and national wildlife areas. If you sum all that up, it's a huge expanse. It's about 12 million hectares. That's about the size of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia combined. So a large part of the country and very critical habitat. There's 16 of these are Ramsar sites, wetlands of international importance. Many of these have been designated as important bird areas. That's a scientific designation for habitat that's particularly important for birds. So this isn't just any old habitat, this is very important habitat. So several things we said to Parliament that concerned us about this. First of all, in terms of what is known about the ecological integrity of those sites, the information is concerning. So if you look at the national wildlife, well, between 55 and 70% of these sites have ecosystems that are less than adequate. So again, these are supposed to be protected areas. This isn't just habitat that's out there with no protection. These are protected areas, and yet the state of the ecosystems is less than adequate in the majority of cases. The other concern that we had about this is that a central thing to protect the ecological integrity of a protected area is the idea of a management plan. Again, some parallels with the idea of a recovery strategy for SARA. And this is a management plan for a protected area, basically says what you're trying to do, what the restrictions are, what you're really trying to achieve. Environment Canada's management plans are quite outdated. They average about 20 years old. Environment Canada, by its own assessment, classifies about 90% of those plans to be inadequate. So both those were areas of concern that came out of this. This is a bit more information about that. We looked to, so next piece of the work. Again, federal government does a number of different things, as I said before. Another thing it does is it cuts checks, it spends money. It has 5 different programs, 3 focused specifically on species at risk, and 2 more general habitat protection areas. And we asked a question of all those, which is how well are they tracking what they're actually achieving? How well are they tracking results? Largely positive picture. The one message coming out of this part of our work that I thought particularly important was that we have a pretty good understanding about what each of these individual pieces, each program is doing, but not a very good sense of how they all work together, particularly in terms of supporting the recovery strategies for species at risk. So as an example, the piping plover has been supported by 80 different projects, but no one has a clear idea of what the sum total impact of those 80 projects is. nor a clear sense of how well that covers the things that are set out in recovery strategies and action plans that need to be done in terms of recovery of species. And I'll leave that part of our work at that. If I point this different ways, I'm doing experiments here to see if I point different ways and do different pressures. Do you have any theory? If I point back here, does that? This is going to be interesting. Ah, it works. You found it. Now, the next thing that we looked at, Jeanette has done a good job of explaining some of this, and I'll just kind of fill in some of the additional points. So we looked at this thing, and again, done a good job of explaining the recovery strategies, the action plans that follow from those. We asked the question of how well is the federal government meeting its legislative responsibilities for leading the development of these recovery strategies, and they're very strict timelines that were put in that legislation. So what we found is that a good number of them are overdue. We found, just repeat the stat that Jeanette had, over 500 species have been designated under the Species at Risk Act, 518 at the moment. Of those, about 150 of the recovery strategies are overdue. And you recall she made the point that there's two parts, there's two things you need to be planning well the recovery of a species, a recovery strategy and then an action plan. And the action plan, again, is one of these things. And when they're done extremely well, and it explains who's going to do what and where the responsibilities are and the resources and deliverables and all that good stuff. And so if you look at the combination of those 518 species, only 7 have those two pieces of the puzzle in place, the recovery strategy and the action plan, 7 of the 518 species. Another bit of analysis what we did is we essentially took, Parks Canada and Fisheries and Oceans have done relatively well in the last few years to try to deal with their backlog. Environment Canada, and Environment Canada has a much larger backlog and probably a more difficult job to do to recover, or to, I guess you could say, recover from the backlog, to deal with the backlog. So we projected out Environment Canada's completion rate for these and estimated fairly generously, I would say, that it'd be at least a decade before they have dealt with this backlog, basically dealt with the backlog of recovery strategies which are overdue. A few other things that we had to say about that. One of the key elements in a recovery strategy, not for all species, but certainly a large number of species, is the identification of critical habitat. So these are, this is basically the habitat that species needs. Particularly important where habitat loss or fragmentation is the cause of the extirpation or endangerment or whatever's gotten that species on the list. And only 43% of the recovery strategies had actually identified that. So a few examples that we used, and I don't have any pretty pictures. I have maybe a few later on, but we talked about the wood bison. Wood bison populations have declined by about 90% from historical levels. The recovery strategy was due in 2007, still not there. We talked about the example of the chimney swift, and I mentioned migratory birds and 3 groups having declined 40 to 60%. Chimney swifts are a member of the aerial insectivores. They've declined by 92% since the 1970s, very sharp decline. Recovery strategy for that was due in 2011, still not there. So this is a very important part of what the federal government does in terms of managing conservation, and leaves a considerable amount to be desired. And then, I do have pretty pictures in a moment. So then we looked at the parks system, and Parks Canada has done some I would say starting on a positive point, very remarkable things in terms of ecological integrity. Parks people get that. It's a very pervasive value that you see that impacts on what they do day to day. They've done a lot over the last 10 years where about year 2000, a very important expert panel laid out recommendations that would essentially direct Parks Canada to put much more attention to ecological integrity. Ecological integrity, protecting ecological integrity is the first priority in the Parks Canada Act. thanks to that kind of thinking and that kind of work. So they've done a lot of things, but we had a number of concerns about the state of the parks in terms of ecological integrity. They face quite a significant backlog as well in terms of catching up to things that they are committed to do. So here's some stats, and again, fairly sobering ones, I would think, to my eye anyway. They're only, in terms of ecological integrity of the parks, they're only about 60% through the parks, finishing the work to assess ecological integrity. What they found so far is of concern. So over half of the ecosystems in the national parks, and again, this is the national parks, this is ecosystems that we've put under protection. Over half of those are in less than good condition. About a third of those are ecosystems in decline. So despite quite considerable efforts, Parks Canada is falling behind in terms of that protection. This makes the point, I've made it already, about just how difficult it is to manage ecosystems. It is, again, a combination of all those different factors. Impacted as well, always an issue with protected areas about what happens outside the boundaries of those protected areas. Ecosystems, of course, for some reason, don't pay attention to all these human designs and constructs that we throw in the landscape. I'll talk about, there again, we queued up and I got a million clicks. One example, one specific example, and I was reminded of this in one of Jeanette's examples about sort of historical rates of things and whether you're trying to maintain. That was a very interesting analysis, by the way. I was listening to Jeanette's analysis about just how ambitious those strategies was, and I thought, why didn't we think of doing that? But I'm glad that you did that. One of the things that the Parks Canada tries to do in terms of maintaining ecosystems has to do with fire. And as I'm sure the majority of you would recognize, one of the things that we've done in modern society is we've suppressed fire. So fire's natural role in terms of ecosystem regeneration, clearing out, heavily wooded areas to allow species that require, open terrain. All that natural regeneration has been suppressed. So I mentioned this expert panel in 2000 says that Parks Canada should maintain or restore the role of natural fire to about 50% of its historical rate. In response to that, Parks Canada decided that 50% was a pretty expensive target. It's fairly expensive to maintain fire. You don't just set a fire lightly in a national park. You have to have a lot of people out there to make sure that you're controlling it. So they set the target of 20%, again, 20% of the historical level that would be required to maintain an ecosystem in a pristine state, historical rates, that is. And what we found is only a quarter of the parks have been able to meet that compromised target of 20%. So all to say, a lot of work remains to be done, and there's some pretty pictures. Many of you, since I don't have many pretty pictures, I'll talk about the few that I have. So many of you are familiar with the work that Parks Canada has done in the mountain parks, particularly Banff, as part of the twinning of the Trans-Canada to protect species from roadkill. And they found that they were losing, the situation was quite unsustainable in terms of large mammals, grizzlies in particular, just from roadkill. They were losing far too many and it wasn't sustainable. They would lose those populations. So they fenced along both sides of that. You've probably seen that. And they've got these wonderful overpasses. I had a chance to tour those, several of those last summer. And very few people get on top of those, and that's for good reason because it's for the animals, right? But they're actually quite remarkable. So the two lasting impressions, lasting memories I have of this is, first of all, walking beside the Trans-Canada Highway and how loud that is and how frightening that must be for an animal. And secondly, when you get up on top of one of those overpasses, it's as if you're in the middle of the forest. So they're very remarkably designed. They're extremely wide. They've fine-tuned their design over time and they've widened them further. They've done some really interesting things with berms. You stand in the middle of that and you don't hear the road noise. It's become a very successful way to essentially ensure that the populations can move freely, notwithstanding this huge, cut that's been put through the highway, that is, across those ecosystems. and a few other pretty pictures, and this is just some of the prescribed burns that the parks does. So mindful, again, of time, I'm going to very quickly go through two other things. So that's largely the biodiversity piece. Two other things that we do, I mentioned sustainable development strategies. Very key thing, actually an idea that dates back to the Brundtland Commission and Our Common Future 1988. A lot of attention to this at the Earth Summit as well. And basically, a sustainable development strategy is the idea that a government really needs a game plan. It needs to know what it's trying to do in terms of sustainability and then follow through. And we do continuing work on this. Much of our message is that the game plans are not usually very clear and they're not very measurable. And so at the end of the day, federal government managers don't have a good sense of whether they're achieving what it is that they have set out to achieve, nor does anyone else. And I'm going to then, one last thing I said I would mention, I will, the environmental petitions process, there's information outside on this. It's basically a very interesting right that's provided to all Canadians to ask a question about the environment or sustainable development to a government minister, and in the law, the minister has to respond to those questions within a span of 120 days. And we manage that process. Information if you're interested in how to actually do that. And these have been over 400 petitions since the inception of this. They cover a wide range of environmental topics. Basically anything of concern to Canadians has come up once or many times in these petitions. So as I mentioned, I wanted to kind of pull together some of the larger, what I think are the larger messages coming out of this work, specifically on biodiversity. So, the first is the recognition that this is really important to us. So it's important to us in terms of our national identity. Other countries put stars and stripes and sickles on their flag, and we put a maple leaf on our flag. So it's obviously a key part of our national identity. But also very much in terms of our national interests. So I talked a little bit about the socio-economic prosperity aspect of this. One of the other things that we highlighted, and this all comes from a chapter in this report, which is named The Commissioner's Perspective. It's more of an op-ed. It's almost like an op-ed piece of things that I think are particularly important. And so we talked quite a bit in that part about how important these issues are in terms of the economy from the perspective of us as a relatively small open trading nation. So much of our ability to trade on the international stage is increasingly a function of how well we manage the environment, whether we're talking biodiversity or other aspects of the environment, but biodiversity in particular, I would say. You see that in the debates over large pipelines here, Northern Gateway, Keystone XL in the United States. You see that in terms of increasingly stringent environmental protection requirements that are in international trade agreements. So the point, it's not just about our national identity. This is very, very key to our national economics and prosperity. Very challenging to manage ecosystems. I've talked about that. We're losing grounds. All ecosystems are deteriorating. Environment Canada did a very interesting historic piece of work in 2010. We raised concerns that they have not planned to repeat this, which we think is quite unfortunate. Pulled together all the information available in Canada, or much of it anyway, in terms of states of ecosystems. And the findings, again, fairly sobering. They identified all major types of ecosystems are declining. The only question is how rapidly. Some not particularly significantly at this point, but other ecosystems, ice ecosystems being a good example, are declining very, very dramatically. So we are losing ground. We talked, and maybe I will finish on this point. We talked about, and this has become kind of the way we've summed up the whole work this year on biodiversity, that essentially what we see is a wide and persistent gap between what the federal government has committed to do and what it's legally obliged to do, and what it's actually achieving and what it's actually trying to do. So a wide and persistent gap. And the last point we make here, and we talk about a number of examples of this, is that the only way to actually bridge that gap is to do things differently. We put a strong emphasis on collaboration, about how the federal government really needs to find common ground with other partners, get out of the idea that the federal government is has the deepest pockets around the table and is sort of, the first among equals, and to think very much about where shared agendas are. We had an interesting example of a real success story in conservation in this country, and it's the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. So back in the 1980s, scientists were very concerned about waterfowl populations. They were declining quite dramatically. So there was very clear scientific information to say waterfowl populations were endangered. And what happened in the face of that was a really interesting example of collaboration. So the Canadian government, the American government, and eventually over 300 different interest groups in civil society collaborated on a massive exercise to try to deal with those declines. They've managed over, again, relatively short space of time, in my view, several decades. They've managed to protect over 8 million hectares. That's an area the size of New Brunswick. And you see waterfowl populations have rebounded quite dramatically, and much of that's been attributed to the work that's done. So again, collaboration is critical to this. Good information, we talked how important science is. When you see success stories in conservation, quite often one of the keys to that success is clear science. So raptor populations, another case. Raptor populations were under considerable stress. There was very clear science that linked that to pesticides, DDT in particular. Regulatory action was taken. Raptor populations have rebounded. So good science is critical. Sound management practices, that's that auditor thing, action plans, et cetera, and transparency and engagement. So there's some of our contact things. At that, I will turn it back over to Nadine. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Maxwell. Our next speaker is from the WWF. He has worked with WWF Canada for the past 7 years in the conservation sector's efforts to see an ecosystem-based management plan developed for the Great Bear. He also campaigns to keep projects that are inconsistent with healthy ecosystems, like the Northern Gateway Pipeline, out of the Great Bear. Personally convinced that the largest challenge for future generations will be finding a way to prosper on a finite planet, James has joined the growing ranks of people seeking to establish a gentler relationship between society and the natural world. So James will be talking about his campaign to protect biodiversity, what it looks like, and what we can do to help. And I hope he tells us what the carrots are for. Thanks. All right, I'm going to have to...
Thank you so much. Let's see if it'll work. No, not in this day. Excellent. We're good. Oh, I better have a watch to stay on time. Am I allowed to walk, or do I have to be here?
No, go ahead.
Okay, but I do have to turn on my mic. Perfect, okay. Well, thank you for the invite. I'm happy to be here. First, I was just reflecting on the picture that's up here. This actually happened to be me in Prince Rupert, out mapping eelgrass. And I think I owe a couple of people a thank you. This was about 7 years ago, before I was working for WWF, and I was looking for, why did that happen? There we go. I was looking for a way to become engaged in some issues, and happened to walk into the office up there and met a nice young lady named Jen Rice, who said, well, we're putting on a course about mapping and monitoring eelgrass for volunteers. And Nikki Wright from Sea Change was coming up and took us out in the field. And one early morning, as the sun was rising on the side of the ocean, we're out walking around in the mud, looking down, mapping eelgrass. And sort of the rest is history, and that's why I'm here. And I think that's going to be one of the main themes of my talk, is the choice that we have to take to engage. And I'll come back to that as we move along. There we go. So just maybe a question to the audience, since I don't really know who's in the room. If I was to say the current status of our work, or the current status of ecosystems and our actions on ecosystems in Canada was adequate, who would agree with that statement. So basically, we're doing a good enough job. No. Okay, so we're on the other side of the fence for the most part. We think we need to improve, right? And I would tend to agree. And the question is, why are we failing to protect our species, conserve our habitats? Why, globally and in Canada, does biodiversity continue to decline? And I got to say, I don't really know. I mean, you get to find out about the carrots now. It seems pretty simple to me, really. What we need are a few carrots to act as motivation. In the odd situation, maybe we needed some big sticks to leverage and get some movement out of people who aren't cooperating. We definitely need, as already mentioned, some good science, preferably in a simple format that people can understand and act on. And at the end of the day, we've got to get out there and tell some stories. We've got to tell people why this matters. Should do the trick. That's why I'm here. I love Farley Mowat, by the way. I love the nature of things and the series on the whales. Oh, it escaped me right now, so I should have put it in my notes. But it was a story that motivated me. So simple, right? Seems good enough. So what I'll do to get some action out of everyone, I'm going to pass around my hat, and you're going to fill it with money, right? So there we go. You can fill it full of money. Just kidding. You don't have to. It's a joke. And we're going to take that money. We're going to hire an expert on humpback whales, and we're going to find out why maybe it's not such a good idea to put tankers through a critical habitat for humpback whales. And we're going to take that, and we're going to go out and maybe do a little bit of protesting, dare we say, outside of Christy Clark's office. And she's going to come out after hearing all the noise, and we're going to tell her a story about how important the Great Bear is to us. She's going to say, oh, I didn't realize. Great. Well, maybe we won't put that pipeline there then. Maybe we will put it through Burrard Inlet instead. Oh, excellent. Problem solved. No worry for the humpback whales anymore. Oh, going the wrong way. But wait a minute. Didn't I read something about southern orcas? Isn't there an issue with those as well? Anybody seen that hat? I could use some more money. I think we need to do this again. Okay, maybe I'm oversimplifying. Maybe this is a bigger issue than what I'm sort of alluded to at the beginning. Maybe there are some global pressures out there, such as population, consumption, technology, that are making this issue systemic. That's requiring action from us at multiple levels. And that what we need to do as individuals is figure out how we can engage in those multiple dimensions that swirl around the influences that decide how we manage our resources. It's a common expression in conservation that we don't manage nature, we manage our relationships and how people interact with nature. Essentially, we manage people. But to date, our thinking about managing people and relationships has often been superficial. It's been one-dimensional. It's about forcing people to do something different. However, I think, given the scale of our challenge, we really need to dig deep into the roots of our decision-making within society. And I think that's not something that conservation biologists really tend to think a lot about. And so I've turned to another fellow, a fellow called Stephen Lukes, who has an interesting perspective on power and what he calls the 3 dimensions of power. And I'll use it here just as the 3 dimensions and the 3 dimensions of decision-making. And at risk of gross oversimplification, Luke's first dimension of power is the decisions that are on the table. Should you build a pipeline up north or should you build one down here? Should you build a parking lot in Stanley Park or should you build it underneath an existing city tower? Or it could even be, can you build a better highway by putting a grizzly bear path over it? They're important decisions. This shot here is from a right whale strike on the Atlantic. And the decision subsequently to relocate the shipping lane was an important choice. And it's something we have to do over and over and over again. But it's something that takes a lot of resources, something we can't afford to continue doing as our current lack of progress demonstrates. So I think we need to use the knowledge we're able to garner and understand ecosystems to start making choices about what else should be on the agenda. How else should we manage our resources in a way that's not driven just by the cheapest available products? Oh, I've got a slide in the wrong order as well. Let's see what happens if I go that further. Nope, sorry. Okay, I'm missing a slide maybe. Anyways, okay, so not just by what the cheapest available option is, but what reflects our values. And this is going to require you to make a choice as well. You're going to have to choose to reward companies that go this extra mile. You're going to have to provide carrots to them to take this action. Or if they fail to, you're going to have to think about avoiding them. So basically, you're going to have to decide how you're going to allocate your limited private funds. Of course, you can also make decisions about how you allocate your personal time. This is an Earth Hour event in Toronto, and it's enabled mostly by volunteers. In this event, we have volunteers manning the tables. They've made a decision to engage and allocate their personal time. So are you going to go home tonight and watch Lost? Or are you going to open up the book and maybe learn a little bit about ocean noise? Or I think I had material on the table you could read. But as I was saying, we cannot spend all our time on these limited actions. We need to start thinking a little bit bigger as well. And this is why WWF is so passionate about the Great Bear. Right now, and for the last 2 years, there's been a struggle taking place about who has the legitimacy to set an agenda about what happens in the Great Bear. And it ties back, actually, to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Following that, our signatures on that convention, Canada enacted the Oceans Act. And one of those commitments within the Ocean Act was integrated planning in what we refer to as large ocean management areas. In BC, it happened to be the Pacific North Coast Integrated Management Area. We were fortunate enough that that was moving ahead through a multi-stakeholder process. People like me got to sit at the table. People like my cousin, who's a fisherman, got to sit at the table. People like my uncle, who's a logger, also got to sit at the table. And we got to make decisions about how we used the North Coast to deliver what we wanted from the North Coast. Unfortunately, other people, also sitting at the table at the time, were worried that their interests were not being properly protected. So, the oil and gas and shipping sectors went to the government and requested that the PNSEMA integrated management planning process basically be gutted and now is run internally to DFO without the opportunities for stakeholders to influence it. Amazingly enough, that's not the end of the story. Because some people were able to step up with a lot of carrots, in other words, millions of carrots, another process got started, a process known as the Marine Planning Partnership. Again, it's a multi-stakeholder process, and I again have a chance to sit at the table. But unlike the previous process, the federal government no longer participates, nor does the shipping sector, nor does the oil and gas sector. Forestry, recreation, tourism, fishing, conservation, and academia are all there, and it's led by First Nations in the province. And for the last year and a bit, there have been discussions about how the North Coast, Central Coast, the North Coast of Vancouver Island should get used. And that discussion is founded on concepts of ecosystem-based management and values held to First Nations. But we're coming to a struggle. There's going to be two visions that are going to come out in the next year and a bit about how this coast should get used. Some of them are going to be rooted in the PNCEMA process, driven by oil and gas and the federal government, and some of them are going to be rooted in the MAP process. And this is where your actions are needed. We need you to choose to engage, choose to make the MAP process, if it reflects your values, as robust as possible, choose to answer to decision makers that this is your preferred option. But I think there's even more at play in this story, even more at stake. This is only the second level or dimension of power. The Great Bear also represents the third. The Great Bear is unique in the world. WWF actually gave the participants who established the forest agreement a gift to the earth because of their commitment to ecosystem-based management. Something that set a precedent. I don't know how familiar some of you are with how it gets managed, but within the Great Bear, there's something called ecosystem risk curves. And basically, they are an attempt to quantify the concept of limits. I'm going to say that word again, limits. It's amazing to me. The debate over sustainability hinges on this concept of limits and accepting that maybe there are ecological limits. And to have it here on such a scale was just boggling, really. And so that's why the fight over what happens in the Great Bear is so critical. It's a model for Canada, it's a model to the world, and it's something we as Canadians can say we're proud to help see as a success. It's an alternative to the industrial growth model. Maybe not fully implemented yet, maybe not fully successful, but it's a working model that we need to embrace and champion, that you and I and all of our friends and family need to embrace and champion. And this comes back to sort of what can you do in terms of action and engagement at this level? You can tell stories. You need to tell stories. You need to testify to all your friends and neighbors about why you're making these choices so that we can grow as a movement until we have the weight we need to influence decisions. We're not opposed to the Enbridge pipeline just because it's a bad idea. We're opposed because our hearts rest in the Great Bear and the concepts that exist there. And it's my heart that provides me the emotions to come here and talk to you today about how important it is. I'm going to switch gears a bit, though, because I've learned a thing or two during my time campaigning around the Great Bear. And one of the things I've come to understand, I think, or one of my ideas, maybe I'm wrong in it and I'm misunderstanding, is I think Canadians as a whole have shifted in their thinking about how they think about forests. No longer are they just trees with timber, rather they're ecosystems and forests. And our oceans aren't just places for fish anymore. They're places where whales live, sea lions, orcas, nudibranchs. They're beautiful. I don't think the same holds true for water. Sad story is, about 40% of our freshwater species actually live in freshwater, fish species actually live in freshwater. But fresh water only makes a tiny portion of the surface of the planet, less than 1%. And then, to bring that lesson home a bit, in BC, over 30% of our freshwater species are under some sort of threat. So one of my missions is to try and make us think about rivers and lakes as ecosystems. They're not just places where we get fresh drinking water, even though that's great. And they're not just places we take water out to irrigate our crops, even though that's also important. These are places where fish live, frogs breed, and bugs crawl on the rocks. And for some of us, that's exciting. And I think it's important, just like with the Great Bear, that we tell this story, which is one of the reasons I'm so enamored with the Water Wealth Project. And you guys can go visit this if you like. It's basically an opportunity to put your story about water on the map. It's to engage in that highest level piece of work at that third level of decision making where we talk about norms and values. Of course, there's also the opportunity to engage in that second level here as well. So I think many of you probably know that BC is on the verge of tabling what they would call a Water Sustainability Act. This has taken years and years and years of work. But I think it's a unique opportunity. And one of the reasons I think it's a unique opportunity is because within the Act, there is a promise to consider environmental flow. In other words, to consider in all decision making how much water a river, a fish, a frog, a turtle need. But this is an interesting challenge as well, let's say. Because sometime over the next 3 months, there's going to be a choice over a single word. And the word is going to be may or must. And it's going to be decision makers may consider environmental flow or must consider environmental flow. And this is, again, your opportunity to act. You need to communicate to decision makers that you expect the act to pass and that decision makers must consider the needs of the environment. And it's only if we all speak as a group will that word change from may to must. So this is going to take a lot of mobilization. It's going to take a lot of carrots and a lot of sticks to make that happen. And it's only going to be one fight. Across Canada, there are a number of pressures, a number of activities, a number of projects, and hundreds of species that are going to require action on each of us and all of us in however possible, whatever means possible, from climate change to food systems to drinking water to our energy systems. All of this hinges on how we treat our water. And it's going to take tons of research if you can provide it, tons of funds if you can provide it, hours of storytelling and engaging debate. But I don't think we really have a choice. The future, I believe, of our society hangs on our relationship with water. It's our bridge to a better future if we allow it. And I don't really know how we can do anything but make it a reality. Thank you.
So we can start our Q&A session or our discussion session now. So I'll get the speakers to turn on your personal mics and then just have a seat at the table and have a glass of water if you like. So When you ask a question, I was going to ask the speakers to repeat the question so that it enters the mic. And I, through the magic of technology, will be receiving questions from our online viewers. And if you are online, you can just write your question in your comment section, and we will read it there. Okay. So, any questions?
Question for Neil. I thought you made really excellent points about the evaluation and all the things that the government can improve upon. And I'm just curious, from your experience, how that is received then from the government, and then what capacity they have to make those changes, and if you know if they might be planning to make any of those changes, or how much hope they have.
Great question. I guess my experience is. Okay, yes, sorry. That's the real answer. So the question was about how are all these messages received, and how hopeful you are, I guess, about action and how things get dealt with certain things. So how are these messages received? I think it's very mixed. But maybe I'll start with the optimism plan. I mean, as people ask me, I've been in this business about 30 years or so, and many of these messages are recurring, and some of the things I said here I could have said 10 years ago. So those are really often the disappointing parts of this. I didn't say discouraging, I said disappointing. I think that I always remain very optimistic that we're going to deal with the issues, and my optimism, I think, is a function of a couple of things. One is that I've seen enough of those success stories like the North American wildfire management plan, and many others to say it can happen. And I think, James has spoken about some of the ground rules that's done. So I think there's enough success stories there. But I think the other reason that I remain quite optimistic is largely the point that these are issues that are far too important to not get act about. And they will act about. I mean, they do get act about. I think the question is always a matter of do we react in time? Do we do the smart thing? Do we react before it really is a crisis? Do we react when we can still do things on the preventative side? I mean, I am that heavy restoration side. Prevention is always so much smarter because Joanne made this point too. You can't restore things when you're talking about conservation issues. And even if you can do it, if you can do that little eyedropper thing that the bees do so well, it's going to be extremely costly. So I think things do react, and the question is can we get to it fast enough? I'd say one other thing I'd say, I think it's sort of a mixed reaction I see on messages like this. And I think that's just a question of the values of different people bring to these kinds of issues. What I find the most disappointing, this is the term, is that kind of myopic short term, it's all about
of the success stories that I see are not governments doing things in a singular, on their own. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think, and I talked a lot about some of the messages that for us came out of those success stories, which was the power of collaboration. So I think the thing that has caused a lot of the problems are governments thinking they can do it alone. They don't need to consult, they don't need to engage. In truth, they do. Government pockets have, at times we thought government pockets were endlessly deep. Well, they're not really. And some of the really cool collaborations going on are really broad-based collaborative things. I think of the work that's been done to engage citizens in terms of citizen science. I mean, that's remarkable stuff.
But that's coming from the outside in, right? Like, it's not the government going out and looking for collaborators most of the time.
I think it's a mix. I don't think it's necessarily that the government has to be the one that's the cheerleader that always brings everyone together. I think what's important is the government is there to do what governments can do. And again, I think a lot of the success stories are just broadly based collaborative things. Corporations seeing enlightened self-interest, finding common agenda with citizen groups and governments there too. The other part of accountability, of course, is something we call democracy, which is the ultimate accountability that all this stuff works around.
You actually just mentioned that the collaboration with industry and the dual goals that sometimes the environment and dual industry can have. And I was wondering, this is a question to the panel, if there's potential, because the federal government are failing so much in delivery of protection of biodiversity, that collaboration with industry in the way of biobanking and other such methods could be adopted to encourage and sustain biodiversity while still pushing their agenda of a pipeline or an LNG facility.
And that was...
I'd like to get everything.
Sure.
Could you repeat the question?
Right, yes. So I probably can't repeat the question because I was thinking about the answer. But your question goes to the role that partnerships with industry can play as vehicles and as, I guess, as means of moving things forward. Do you want to?
Yeah, I suppose the analogy of carrots. I mean, they have a lot of carrots to provide. So in the granting of a permit for an LNG facility, that can generate an awful lot of capital. And that capital could then be used in biobanking and biodiversity and habitat improvements. And I'm just wondering if because the federal government are failing so much, if there's potential to incorporate private industry into the encouragement and the sustainability of biodiversity in Canada.
So if industry has a lot to gain, then they potentially have a lot to invest
exactly.
and contribute to the process. And I think it's a lot to expect of industry to step up company by company. Where I see the biggest opportunity is in creating systems that reward, where the government provides the reward to industry for meaningful conservation action and conservation partnerships, or where regulation provides the stick. And where regulation provides the stick, I think my sense of industry is not that industry is anti-environment or that industry as a uniform statement across all industry, or that industry doesn't want to participate, but industry needs to compete. And so a level playing field provided by regulation, even if it's strict regulation, is actually relatively acceptable to industry by and large. We tend to think about certain industries and focus on those, but broadly speaking, there are certainly industries, including industries that extract resource or that utilize resource, that are keen to participate in maintaining their resource. I think the forestry sector in BC has certainly shifted enormously over the last 30 years in terms of becoming a participant in stewardship and in sustainability of that industry.
Can I take a stab at that one? Thanks. Hope that doesn't echo too bad. Partly my response goes back to the previous one about issues of the environment are too big not to be of concern to anybody, government or industry. If you take somebody like Walmart, Coca-Cola, Tex in the room, there's no way that they can foresee a future where they do not have to consider environmental issues. Coca-Cola is an example in terms of water. Huge water user, they know it. It's a huge risk for them, they have to address it. Loblaws, international supply chain. They've got to have secure supply for their business model to work. They can't afford not to have low carbon shipping. If the prices of carbon shipping go up, they can't get their stuff from the developing world into stores across North America. So I think industry is a player because they have to be. And it's not because we're forcing them, because that's the only way they can be competitive in the future.
You have the yes. Yeah, one of the themes I heard coming out of what you were all saying was the importance of transparent information. So James talked about members of the public engaging in decision making and saying what we think. And Neil, one of your suggestions was, sound science and then transparent science. Jeanette showed an example with recovery objectives of things other than science affecting something that by law is required to be only science. And I guess I'm wondering from all of you, and especially from Neil, how we can increase transparency about the lack of transparency. And in particular, when I look at the Species at Risk Act, so many of the failures are related to that lack of transparency, all of the litigation, certainly. And so I guess that's where I'm looking for ideas about solutions and useful ways to apply pressure or shine lights.
So the question was about how do we increase the transparency, about the lack of transparency, a nice way to frame that. I don't know that there's any magic answer. I agree with all the premise of what you said. I mean, I think where you see where science is going, and a lot of information is the notion of open platforms, open data, and you see the power of what happens when you can do that, and you can start connecting data sets that were never designed to be connected, and and the role of information brokers to try to kind of connect all those things. So I think that's extremely powerful, not just in the environmental area, but in many areas of science. And I'm not a scientist, so I don't claim any special expertise in this area, but I do see those things, and I hear a lot of people talking about that. I think the other thing I would say about science is that science is one of those professions that's had a long-standing, it's been organized around the idea of transparency, the whole idea of publish, the whole idea of peer review. So you're not going to have sound science unless there is that degree of transparency. So that's probably one of those fundamental things that people keep forgetting about. So science that happens in a vacuum, science that happens in a big organization that never sees the light of day, that doesn't strike me as good science. Scientists, we should ask her.
Yeah, can I add to that? I guess I would add 2 quick points, and one is that I think that that while science is fundamentally transparent, it's transparent behind a curtain in that peer-reviewed science is not broadly available to the public, and so then it falls to communication. It falls to primarily to academic scientists to communicate, given that government scientists are perhaps more limited in their ability to communicate openly about implications of their work, and because scientists working in NGOs may have more of a perception of having an agenda that they're driving, and so I think there is a leadership role for academic scientists to play, but I think there's also a leadership role, obviously, for institutions such as this, such as the aquarium, to play in terms of translating that science for for public communication. And so the transparency is fundamentally there. You can access a whole lot of information, but that information does sometimes have to be communicated via mechanisms that are more accessible.
I think there's a sad story to the question you just asked as well. And the sad story is one that the information gathered by industry and environmental assessments or other decision-making processes isn't actually shared all that publicly with us. And that failure is not really well known by the public. And we trust that that information is going into government, and government's now analyzing it and making sound decisions. And so I'm going to share a bit of a story around run-of-the-river hydro. I don't have a particular issue with run-of-the-river hydro. I'm sure it can be done well. However, in issuing water licenses to run-of-the-river hydro, Susan might as well tell the story, but in issuing water licenses to run-of-the-river hydro, there's a requirement to monitor, but there isn't a requirement to report. So they didn't. And so over the last year, I got the opportunity to participate in a review of the impacts of run-of-the-river hydro. And we went looking for data. Figured, we'll go talk to the province. They probably have it. Nope. It's sitting in somebody's inbox somewhere. We've got to go track it down. Now, that's just one story, and I'm sure there's lots of others out there. But I don't think the public is aware of this gap. And I don't want to be all negative, so I'm going to maybe share an opportunity as well. And it goes by the name of the Skeena Knowledge Trust, the Babine Monitoring Trust, and the Maurice Monitoring Trust. And basically, it's outside of government. It's a number of citizens that have become concerned and set up funding arrangements independent of government, where there's a stakeholder discussion about what should be monitored, when, and all the people that live and operate in those rivers feed into the trust to allow that monitoring to happen. So the information is publicly available to all of those people. I'm not saying that's the best way to do it. It would be nice if we could trust government to provide that information, but it's an opportunity.
First of all, I'd like to thank the aquarium and the panelists for coming today. I think this kind of event is very important for increasing transparency and making known what is known. Neil, I'd like to ask you, as a new commissioner, and as someone who is less familiar with the commissioner's office than I'd like to be, I'd like to understand what was the impact of previous commissioners' reports, one, and has there been any modifications to the commissioner's office's mandate and sticks and carrots in recent years?
Right, so the question, and remembering this is my job to repeat the question. So the question was about the commissioner's mandate and how it's changed and what kind of reaction or what's happened from previous impacts of the work that we've done. So again, probably not unlike my answer to the first question, probably sort of a mixed picture. So we do track certain metrics, like when we make a recommendation, does the recommendation get acted on? And it tends to say, you know, often enough that it gets acted on, but not as often as you might want. So the numbers tend to be maybe half the time. If you look after 2 or 3 years, maybe half of them get acted on. And there's always that sort of element of progress. So even something, I didn't talk too much about this, but since both Jeanette and I had talked about the SARA example, I'll maybe use that SARA example. So recovery strategies, so 150 are late, overdue right now, 10 years for Environment Canada to catch up, you heard all that. If you go back and you look, I didn't talk much about Fisheries and Oceans and Parks Canada, so we did very similar analysis 2008. Between 2008 and this work that we just did in 2013, So it's a period of about 5 years. Those two organizations had quite a bit to deal with their backlog. So I think, again, kind of a mixed set of progress. Keeps us in business, keeps us going. The point I would make about progress, though, and I think the biodiversity file really illustrates this nicely, is it's not so much that governments are not making progress. I use the Parks Canada as a good example too. They've made a lot of progress. I think it's really the question of how significantly the challenge is increasing. It's the rate at which the challenges are increasing relative to the rate at which they can act. And the metaphor that I used a little bit in this report that I like, because it's just a vivid image for me, it's like trying to go up the down escalator. You know, so they are doing things, and it's all good things, and they're extremely well intentioned. I mean, the other thing that I've found over the years is that it's rare to find a public servant, particularly in the environmental field, it's not really trying hard to work in the public interest. They're very dedicated lot. Parks Canada, Environment Canada, Fisheries and Oceans. I mean, people like that don't go into those places and spend their whole career there unless they get it and they really want to try to change things. So that's sort of, I guess, my sense of progress. Mandate is largely the same as what we had when we started work in 1995, and we think the mandate works fine. We don't think we need to expand the mandate. We've got enough to do as it is.
Can I follow? Might be actually a question to Neil. I'm not sure if you're allowed to do this on panels. The way we are governed in Canada has changed since your position was created. So more power is now vested in the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office, and not so much in the Cabinet and the legislature. So I'm just wondering, is your mandate as relevant given this change in power and decision-making that the country's seen?
Yes. And that's a question I don't have to summarize because he's mic'd. There's clearly that phenomena, that centralization of power. I'm not a student of international government, but I've read enough to know that this is not a uniquely Canadian phenomena. It isn't a recent phenomenon in Canada either. You can trace it back to governments in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. So this is a continuing thing. You see it in the UK, you see it in the United States as well. Centralization of power, you see it in provinces here and other federations. It does change a bit of the dynamic in terms of the effectiveness of an organization like our own, which really does serve Parliament. So it's a function of how much Parliament actually takes its job of holding the government accountable, the extent to which it focuses on that job. I was critical in this last report, and my predecessor was as well, about what we both see as a declining parliamentary interest in a lot of these issues. It used to be parliamentary committees spent a lot of time working with the results of our work, and other organizations too that are really trying to inform Parliament about environmental matters, sustainable development matters, that we haven't seen as much of that attention in recent years, and that I think is concerning. I mean, the whole notion of accountability in our whole system of parliamentary government is the notion of the elected government is accountable to Parliament. So it only works. I keep saying no one's accountable to me. I'm just simply saying what government's doing and telling Parliament and telling Canadians about that. And
We're going to take 2 more questions. So how about lady in the front?
Okay, this is to Neil. If I recall correctly, in reading through the auditor's report, there was a section on marine protected areas. I'm interested that when you mentioned the challenges of protecting our national heritage, that there was no mention of the Oceans Act or the Fisheries Act. Is that not part of our national heritage?
so the question was about Marine Protected Areas, Oceans Act, and no parent message and mention, which is true, and that is largely just because we had not looked at that in this particular report. We'd actually looked at that, this may be the reference that you're thinking of, we looked at that in the report that preceded this in 2012. So we did quite a bit of work looking at the Oceans Act and the establishment of marine protected areas. And actually, I was here with my predecessor last year, a year ago, talking about that work. Very similar picture that emerges from that in terms of marine protected areas. One of the commitments that we've made under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and we keep ratifying this one, is to protect 17% of the land mass and 10% of the ocean areas. There is a shortfall for certainly on the land side, a bigger shortfall on the ocean side. So right now we're about 1% versus that 10%. You look at places like Australia, but last time I looked, I think Australia was about 36%. Very remarkable difference. We've done quite a bit of work on the Oceans Act, 1996 Oceans Act. You know, a remarkable bit of legislation in terms of the ideas that were put into that. The idea, and James spoke about this, integrated management plans, designation, that whole notion of having a planning process that brings all those multi-stakeholders together was quite remarkable. And again, and James had a good example of, you know, some successes and some failures. You know, the Oceans Act has never really, the message that keeps coming up every time we look at the Oceans Act is, great idea, time to put it in practice. You know, there has not been the kind of movement, a little bit more than there was before in terms of creation of marine protected areas, but still a big shortfall.
Could I just make another comment to that? Because some of the questions about citizen involvement, citizenship, and that sort of thing, and I can speak personally for this, is when you're saying there's not been enough movement in fulfilling those great ideas and concepts in the Oceans Act, apart from the fact that that now has kind of been swept away, or a lot of it pulled out from under our feet, citizens are getting involved because we are not getting government doing what was, or I still consider their jobs, and people are so concerned that we are trying to do things from the ground level up. So I guess I'm in part responding to some of the questions about citizenship and that kind of thing, because it is great, but we're destroying it, and yet it is part of our national heritage. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to take that away, that citizens are getting so upset that we're actually trying to get involved. It's not our job, but boy, we're taking extra jobs on so that we can get our message back to the government to say, no, 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 you're going in the wrong direction. Sorry, this is a passion of mine. I just had to say it.
One last, John, did your question get stolen?
No,
Oh, you, okay.
You know, speaking for an institution like the aquarium, where I mean, everybody here tonight's the choir, right? And of course, governments respond to public interest, respond even more to public pressure, which usually requires, half the room is lawyers, usually requires a larger presence than the choir sitting here tonight. And so one of the struggles is around the concept of biodiversity itself. It's a very hard concept for people who haven't thought about it, who haven't had a good instructor to even grasp. And there's been a lot of effort continent-wide with a number of institutions and organizations trying to talk my next door neighbor, who isn't a biologist at all, into understanding that biodiversity is important and using economics and so it's you know, and I know organizations like WWF there's a lot of strategy discussion going on in terms of how to grow the choir. What the whole issue of how to do that, of course, we could take several nights of panels to discuss that. But I'm just kind of wondering how the issue of the basic how each of you views that issue of the basic disconnect from 99% of the Canadian public interested in understanding of biodiversity and its importance versus, you know, we had a series of very enlightened government actions, principally in the 90s, that seemed to be not quite living up to the hopes everybody had for them. How institutions like the aquarium are all ears for ideas in terms of how we begin to correct that disconnect.
Wow, okay, look at me, huh? I was, oh, sorry, do I have to repeat that? Was that loud enough for everyone?
That's okay, we can.
How do we make communications better? Boy, you know, you're right, we do. We try everything under the sun that we can think of, right? And sometimes to more or less success. So I don't think I have any new insight for you there. Other than a very interesting talk that I heard yesterday, and I've actually heard it a few times now, by Angus McAllister, who you should probably invite to one of these sessions, who's done a lot of polling across Canada about the views of Canadians and the environment. And his one piece of advice for us is there's basically 3 or 4 segments within the Canadian population. There's the choir, for sure. We don't worry about talking to them. I'm sorry, I don't really want to ignore you and people like you, but the other segment is people who are interested but busy. They have other priorities. And they really are the vast majority. And they're swayable to a limited degree of action. So when I asked a lot of you, I asked less of them. And it may be as simple as buying Ocean Wise or going to the Ocean Wise choice on the menu. That's about as much as I can expect. Is it enough? Probably not, and we need to find ways to lower that barrier. And then that sort of third segment are the naysayers. And really, I think, now his name escapes me. I may be saying this wrong, but basically ignore them. I mean, they don't really have a ton of influence. So keep doing the good stuff and hopefully find ways to lower the barriers. It's sort of not all that insightful, but that's where I'm at.
Can I just ask an interesting question? If you walked up to every MP in Parliament and said, "Can you tell me what biodiversity means?" Any guess how many could even begin to give you a rational answer?
I've only actually encountered one that spent a lot of time in this and actually engaged me quite. I thought it was quite enjoyable, though. You know, how do you define biodiversity? And his point was, if you can't define it, how can you manage it? And I said, great point, but we're so far away from sort of restoring things to a pristine state that it's kind of an academic question, in my mind. I guess in answer to your first question, I think only 2 things come to mind. So I don't have the experience that the 2 of you would have at that sort of practical grassroots level. But 2 thoughts come to mind. One is I think it's, and I agree with the premise of your starting point, which is biodiversity, difficult concept for people to get their heads around. I think that's a lot of why kind of translating this into what does things that matter to people and different people is important in this. So you take the ecosystem services concept and you say, you know, you make a very good argument, which I hear quite a bit, and I have a lot of time for this argument, that says nature shouldn't have to pay its own way. I mean, it doesn't owe us anything. So, you know, why we're so hung up on the services side that ecosystems provide. They shouldn't need to provide services. But nonetheless, I think it's important because it speaks to a good segment of the population that gets that notion of sort of economics and money and paying your own way. You know, the health issues, other people are really taken by health issues, and a lot of environmental issues, of course, are often framed and can be framed and are framed around health. So I think it's speaking to that diversity of different things. The other thing I was going to say, I think part of the reason that these issues are, you know, and you've used that point about speaking to the choir, I think naturalists, environmentalists get this stuff, and a lot of other people don't get it. And I think that's just a function of just how ordered and engineered our society has become. So an urban population doesn't have that direct experience of biodiversity. A lot of what we've actually created is such an engineered world that we live in, of monocultures. So, you know, most people would live, anyone who lives out in a home, I bet you your garden's pretty monocultured. I know that lawn part's going to be pretty monocultured, you know. So we don't have that direct experience, I think, often, much of the population. I think this is great. Those people that are focused on education, as you know, of course, this institution, Aquarium is, I think, are playing a pretty important role, because once you sort of have that direct experience, then you kind of get this stuff.
I think our time is up for this evening, so I know there's a lot more discussion to be had. Obviously, this has generated a lot of interest. So, you know, feel free to mill around after. So I just wanted to thank our three speakers for providing their unique perspective on the same issue here. So